Thank you very much. So my talk is about basically the formal aspects of a comparison of two documents issued by the late Pope Francis. And it is at the intersections of two of my research interests, one being the theory of argumentation and the other being the concept of future generation and the rights of children. And it is going to be in two parts, one more on the formal and one more on the substantial side, but today what you get is the formal part. Two of Pope Francis's magisterial documents, Laudato Si, on care for our common home, issued in 2015, and Laudate Deum, to all people of goodwill on the climate crisis, 2023, share overlapping concerns: environmental degradation, climate change, justice, and human dignity. Yet the concept of future generations shifts in how central it is and how concretely those future claimants are represented in both of the texts. In Laudato Si, as we are going to see, future generations are often invoked as universal heirs of humankind. In Laudate Deum, children and vulnerable people become more prominent as present rights holders whose future is already being harmed. As I said, Laudato Si came out in 2015 in a context of expanding global environmental concern immediately preceding the UN Climate Conference in Paris, COP21. Its rhetorical situation then was constitutive rather than reactive. Francis sought to articulate a comprehensive theological and moral anthropology capable of grounding ecological concern in Catholic thought while addressing the whole human family. The genre of an encyclical, a letter from the Pope, traditionally carries the highest doctrinal weight among papal documents, after, of course, apostolic constitutions. Yet Laudato Si deliberately expands the audience beyond the Church. The opening words, Laudato Si mi Signore, invoke the Canticle of the Creatures, written by Saint Francis of Assisi, one of the arguably most relatable saints of the Roman Church, even beyond Christianity perhaps, thus immediately situating the document within a more lyrical, contemplative, even inclusive register, that of all creatures. Rhetorically, the text combines pastoral exhortation, moral reasoning, and critique. Francis speaks as a teacher of faith and conscience, but also as a participant in a global ethical conversation. His direct appeals, and I quote, "I urgently appeal then for a new dialogue about how we are shaping the future of our planet, create a deliberatively rhetorical frame, persuasion through shared moral imagination rather than command." So the primary audience is the human community as a moral agent. And of course, it has got a secondary audience, an institutional one: policymakers, scientists, and educators, in addition, of course, to religious leaders. In theoretical terms, Laudato Si functions as what Jürgen Habermas would call a communicative act rather than a directive one. Its persuasive force lies in the reasonableness of its moral vision and the effective resonance of its imagery. This text speaks of our common home, employing familial metaphors that translate theological anthropology into ecological solidarity. 8 years later, Laudate Deum appears in a rather different rhetorical and political setting. The Paris Agreement has been signed, yet global emissions continued to rise, and climate negotiations were stagnating. The rhetorical situation just preceding the next climate summit in line, COP28, I think. The rhetorical situation is thus reactive and corrective. France returns to the same moral terrain, now addressing a world that has failed to act. Where Laudato Si aimed to inspire a conversion, Laudate Deum adopts the voice of admonition and also accountability. The very first paragraph of the text states that, and I quote again, "With the passage of time, I have realized that our responses have not been adequate. The tone is prophetic, but it is now also disappointed, and it has got a juridical undertone." This shift from an encyclical to an apostolic exhortation is of course significant. Laudate Deum does in fact presuppose Laudato Si as a foundational doctrine, and it functions as an interpretive supplement or amplification. It is short, it is more polemical. Its style moves from universal address to a rather targeted thing, speaking to political leaders, corporations, and also religious indifference is called to account. Thus, the rhetorical stance changes from one of moral invitation to one of moral indictment. Francis keeps the universal horizon of human dignity, but speaks from within a growing climate emergency. So it takes account of the going of time. The appeal to children and what he calls the most vulnerable personalizes the stakes, translating moral duty in general into a rights-based discourse. If we just have a look at the magisterial dimension, we can say that both an encyclical and an apostolic exhortation belong to the ordinary magisterium. Of course, they are not infallible dogmatic pronouncements, but they do possess high teaching authority. Laudato Si is stronger on the doctrinal side. Encyclicals typically express the Pope's authoritative teaching on faith and morals binding on Catholics in conscience. Laudate Deum, as an exhortation, does interpret and does apply that teaching. It carries persuasive authority rather than anything new in terms of doctrine. And it is perhaps in order to compare that to the functioning of international soft law. In international relations and legal theory, soft law refers to norms, declarations, or instruments that, while not legally binding, do influence state behavior and shape the evolution of customary law or treaty interpretation. You may think of examples as UN declarations, OECD guidelines, or even the Paris Agreement itself. Laudato Si and Laudate Deum then can indeed be regarded as instances of soft law in a more broad ethical juridical sense. They are of course not sources of international law. They do function as normative texts that generate expectation, discourse, and make a pressure rather in the same way soft law instruments do. They do articulate norms, they define standards, care for our common home, integral ecology, and so on. They speak of the responsibility towards future generations on the one hand and the most vulnerable on the other. And these terms do recur in UN and other documents afterwards. They do have a framing function as well, as their language has been incorporated into policy debates. The very term integral ecology appears in several subsequent Catholic and also secular statements. And of course, they do have a persuasive authority. Now, the UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme, and many secular authors explicitly do reference Laudato Si already at COP21 and later at COP28. They do treat them as quasi-ethical framework. If we now look at the evolution of the rhetorical ethos of Francis, then arguably that comes together with the change of a response in the world. The first text presupposes that moral persuasion is sufficient. The second one has to acknowledge that moral persuasion has failed, and therefore appeals to conscience as a juridical category, a conscience bound by the rights of others, and especially of children and the poor, is in order. The shift is then similar to what Hans Jonas calls the imperative of responsibility, the duty to act for the sake of human future in the present, under the conditions of technological power and irreversible harm that has been caused by present actions. In terms of content, it seems safe to say that Pope Francis's ecological teaching also develops over time, and that is especially visible between the two texts. They both address environmental degradation, climate crisis, and so on, but there is still a recognizable shift in how temporal responsibility is being framed, from a relatively abstract moral appeal to future generations in Laudato Si, to a rather focused insistence on children, and especially peoples who are exposed and vulnerable in Laudate Deum. Now first, I have a look at future generations and how they are conceptualized, and then what moral and political claims follow from that, and then how children and vulnerable people come to the focus. In Laudato Si, future generations are a central ethical category under the heading of justice between generations in chapter 5. Francis explicitly states, and I quote, "The notion of the common good also extends to future generations." And further, the environment is on loan to each generation, which must then hand it on to the next. This framing treats future generations as having a collective moral claim. As inheritors of the world, they are owed a world that is kept in good shape. There is also an emphasis in the text on asking what kind of world do we want to leave to future generations, to children who are now growing up. This shows that while future generations are future-oriented, children already here are also included, albeit in a more general way. In Laudato Si, Francis connects justice between generations to the common good. Justice is not only among present persons, but also across time. He argues that sustainable development implicitly requires solidarity between generations. To disregard future generations is an act of injustice. He also indicates that the world is a gift that we have received freely and must be shared. The emphasis here then is both ethical and spiritual. Caring for future generations is tied to questions of meaning, value, and human purpose. It is not primarily judicial or based on rights, but rather on the theological and moral side. And also there is a strong critique of technocratic short-termism and consumerism. Now, if we have a look at Laudate Deum, then we see that Francis stresses that it is children who will pay for the harm done by our actions, and that the ecological crisis threatens their future. Thus, future becomes less abstract. It is instantiated in identified person, mostly in the person of children, with rights that are being imperiled at the moment. Laudate Deum moves beyond moral stewardship toward the language of rights. Those who are vulnerable are claimants of a future that is not merely owed as inheritance, but also as an enforceable or rather urgent moral and legal demand. There is a strong insistence on urgency indeed, ecological, political, and scientific urgency. Now, if we make a more systematic comparison, then we may talk about the primary temporal focus. In Laudato Si, future generations are abstract heirs. Also, in the unborn and posterity in general is referred to, whereas in Laudate Deum, it is children, including present children, vulnerable persons, indigenous peoples, and those all are already affected. In terms of moral language, Laudato Si focuses on stewardship, gift that has been received freely, inheritance, and ecological conversation, and intergenerational solidarity. In Laudate Deum, it is rights, human rights, and on the other side of the equation, accountability, urgent structural and political responsibility. And when it comes to agency versus victimhood, in Laudato Si, future generations are framed as recipients of our moral actions, and present generation are stewards, those who are active. In Laudate Deum, vulnerable persons are sufferers now, and the present generation is obligated to respond, including legal, political, and humanitarian means. How much time do I have? Okay, thank you. I then come to the conclusion. Through comparing Laudato Si and Laudate Deum, one observes a clear development in Francis's ecological moral theology. The concept of future generations becomes less a distant horizon and more a concrete ethical demand centered on children and the vulnerable. Now, while I have been focusing on the shift, it has to be emphasized once again that it is indeed a continuation of the discourse initiated by Laudato Si. So it is indeed a limitation of this present study, because we do not know yet if there has been a shift in Catholic teaching on the environment, or rather just an extension. And secondly, when it comes to rhetoric, one always has to judge by its success, and it remains to be seen how strong an impact Laudate Deum has made in comparison to that of Laudato Si. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for explaining